I'm really delighted that we've been joined this morning by Jason. And I'm going to read the intros because when I was pulling these together this week, the intros ended up being quite long and my memory isn't good enough to remember all of it. So forgive me whilst I read the intros, but I want to do Jason and Babs justice. So Jason is an experienced leader in the data strategy, technology and analytics with over 25 years dedicated to helping companies harness data as a strategic asset. As the managing consultant and founder of Query 7, Jason works with well-known brands like Asda, Unilever, and Euro Garages, guiding them in building data strategies, monetizing data, and applying AI to drive growth. Jason has a practical, hands-on approach and a collaborative mindset. He brings his expertise to businesses of all sizes, helping them leverage data for actionable insights and measurable results. He's passionate about fostering a data-driven culture and empowering teams to turn information into meaningful business value. And as a side note, Jason's just a really nice guy who knows loads about data. And so I think this is going to be such an exciting and really interesting conversation. And now to Babs, we're on the same team. So we're Jamieson Law, but Babs trained and qualified as a corporate and financial services regulatory solicitor with large UK firm Murray and Spence, which is now known as Dentons. And then following for 3 years there, Babs moved into an investment management firm, Martin Currie, where she worked in a split legal and compliance role, dealing with the legalities of a regulated entity as well as regulatory compliance. So that's a really interesting hybrid of that legal and compliance experience. Several years there, Babs left to rejoin the world of private practice and decided to set up her own consultancy law firm, Jamieson Law. This practice has supported thousands of ambitious business owners over the last 5 years to reduce risk and optimize commercial opportunities through practical legalities and swift delivery.
And Babs is also a really great person.
And Babs is also a really great person. And I think the reason this conversation has come about is because from our perspective, from a Jamieson Law perspective, we talk with lots of scaling business owners, and particularly business owners who have a lot of access to data. So either in the fintech, in the SaaS, in the femtech, in the health tech sectors. So lots of really valuable data available to them. And then when I first started talking to Jason, who understands how to really maximize the value of that data and use it as a data asset, it felt like a really great collaboration to talk around how to maximize the value of data in a business. So we've got loads of questions to get to. So I'm going to dive in. Jason, I'm going to come to you first. So what is it exactly that makes data such a valuable asset for a business? And how does that differ from traditional assets?
Yeah, no, thanks. And let me start by saying thank you for the super generous and delightful introduction. Yeah, so I guess the thing that's unique about data is that it's what we often call in the industry a non-depleting asset. It exists, it persists over time, it can be replicated. So unlike a kind of ordinary piece of machinery or inventory, or even if you choose to value stuff that way, human capital, you can copy it, you can share it with a third party, you can combine it for extra value creation. And that makes it qualitatively different to any other asset that you might evaluate. And the other kind of dynamic to data is that it is both a mechanism to drive value and it is a value in and of itself. And that's quite hard. Many companies struggle with this idea that you have an asset that can just be sold for money, but can itself be refined and used internally for a cyclical internal value generation use case. So non-replicative, can create new revenue streams as well as enhance your own kind of efficiency of operation, and is potentially combinable in mechanisms that aren't immediately obvious.
That's really interesting. And are there examples and does it differ perhaps for earlier stage startup businesses versus more established businesses and how they might leverage that data for a competitive advantage?
Yeah, absolutely. To draw kind of 3 examples, you've got long established businesses, and obviously with my background, and this is a very standard grocery retail thing, that have an asset that can be both monetized and used, as I said. So take a company like Tesco or Walmart or those kind of huge players, they realize they're sitting on a data asset that is of value in and of itself, understanding customer shopper behavior across the UK. And they can sell that. They can sell that from anybody to suppliers to them, like Procter & Gamble or Coca-Cola, or to even financial institutions who are looking to optimize their investment portfolio by understanding customer behavior across the UK. So that's an example of kind of driving a new asset, or if you take something like Walmart, as they go into e-com, they are now generating huge amounts of data around folks' propensity to want to substitute products for another one. So every time, if you have bought shopping online, comes to your door, yeah, we didn't have this soap, so we've given you this shower gel. You go, actually, I don't want shower gel, I want soap. That's a useful piece of insight at scale to allow you to inform new product development or kind of marketing or whatever. So for those big ones, smaller companies, our startups, tend to be far more in opportunity identification. So if you take Deliveroo or Instacart, when they were getting going, what they were all about is heat mapping the locations, cities, towns they were moving into and saying, over here, we can quite quickly see that we're not getting the traction. And then why is that? Is our pricing wrong? Is our brand positioning wrong? Is our offer of, in Deliveroo's case, kind of restaurants wrong? So if you're a startup, what you need to be doing is working quickly with the data assets generated from your core business to identify opportunities. Obviously, with a company like Tesco or Walmart, that's less important because they're much more dispersed across their market.
It's a really interesting framing, isn't it? Like different framing for let me use the data to better my product, service, proposition, maybe identify risks or areas that I'm not getting right, versus then I've already got market share, I've already got a great big footprint. So how do I now drive other maybe revenue opportunities or partnership opportunities? That framing is really different.
Very different, very different. And it's around early on in your journey of growing your company, realizing that the information data generated from what you are doing should itself be immediately put into a feedback loop in order to identify whatever opportunity it is, whether it's geographical growth, proposition growth, or portfolio growth, whatever it is that you identify.
And so if you're a smaller organization and perhaps your access to data is a bit more limited, how would you suggest those types of organizations assess like the potential value that they have? Because it could be quite easy to go, don't have lots of access to data. What value do I actually have?
Yeah, and that's a great question. And so it's back to where we slightly started. A good framework to think about is looking at your asset through three different lenses. One is actionability. What data do I have that can change the way I make decisions? And again, back to the delivery example, whether those decisions are opportunity identification or what have you, right? So you've got one, which is how can I create a feedback loop into what the core of my business is to make it better? So that's one of your kind of dimensions. Your second dimension is monetization. Is this data of value to somebody else directly or indirectly? And directly could be quite literally. So to take another example, as a startup I work with, a veterinary company, a company that makes software for veterinary practices. They, as you can imagine, they're generating an enormous amount of data now because a typical vet would have 1,000, 2,000 odd customers, and they've got thousands of those, so millions of pet owners, right? They now have a good map of which parts of, mostly in the US, are cat-oriented, dog-oriented, how much do people spend on food because they can buy food. That is data that's hugely valuable to folks like Nestle Purina or Procter & Gamble or those guys. So does your data have potential direct monetization or even indirect monetization, because that data can be used for improved marketing through an agency, through a Criteo or through a LiveRamp. So is the data monetizable? And then back to where it starts again, enhancement potential. What different assets do you have or have access to that can be combined in a way that makes your proposition better? For instance, a very typical use case would be if, again, let's use Deliveroo. And I don't know if they've done this, but this is me. If I would advise them speculating, they actually, if you include weather forecast data, you can almost certainly optimize, where you might need to have more delivery folks, right? Because if the weather's worse, you have to assume that they're going to, you have to hope they're going slower. And also different weather patterns will presumably prompt different types of behaviors from your customer base as to what kind of food they'd want to buy. So can your purchase pattern data be combined with weather data to optimize for future offers?
I love that. I've never considered Deliveroo mapping their data with weather, but that now you describe it, that makes absolute sense.
You tell they're doing it.
Fab, so just coming across to you, from your perspective, you're often advising organisations on how to protect data and how to ensure that it's being used wisely, fairly, legally. What are the common issues that you come across when you're seeing data organisations handling data?
I feel like, so Jason's telling everybody what they can do with data, and he's going to be the popular guy on this webinar, and I'm going to be the one that tells everybody what they can't do with data and how they have to behave themselves. I can see who's going to be the favourite on this webinar.
Got 5 comments today.
But yes, so I do see a few issues quite regularly that kind of have a bit of a trend across businesses, whether they're small and just getting started, or even if they've been going for kind of 5, 10, 15 years, sometimes we still see some of these same issues. The first one is probably a lack of data mapping. So businesses having a proper up-to-date record of where their personal data is stored, what data they're collecting, why they need it, where it's going, third parties they're sharing it with, that kind of thing. From my perspective, that leads to kind of compliance, security risks. And it means that if they are ever going to be approached by the ICO or even a data subject who has questions, it's all very up in the air. It's all very, we don't know what we're meant to be doing. And that feels to me a bit like a ticking time bomb. And that's not to put the fear into people, because I don't think everybody should shut operations right now and do all of this stuff. But I think it should be on the agenda, and it should definitely be on people's work list to be trundling along in the background, because this is a very important point, both from data subject protection, but also from the point of view of fines, etc., that they could be hit with. Another thing is poor access controls. So a lot of the time I see, to give you an example, I worked with a company a couple of years ago, and they asked me to help them put in place their data protection policies and procedures. And in this organization, every single person in the organization had access to all employee records, and they didn't realize. Everything was held in kind of G drives. That's how they operated the business, but nothing was restricted. So you're talking salaries, national insurance numbers, addresses, personal, very sensitive information. So I think when a business particularly grows very quickly, there isn't always thought to put into that, which can be quite a big risk factor. And it's ideal if a business can identify that before something happens and actually just take the steps now to realise that data should be very much restricted to only those who have a need to see it. Another one is retention issues, businesses keeping data for far longer than they need. I think the issue we have with GDPR is that there's not a set data retention period, which confuses business owners. And I get a lot of the time, how long should I be keeping it for? And my woolly answer is as long as you need it, but no longer. And businesses will need to take a decision and justify that decision. And in some cases that will be no longer than a year, but some cases it's 7 because they need it for the tax authorities, etc. I think just a sensible decision needs to be documented on that and adhered to, but there's no perfect answer. But yes, there are definitely clients that I would work with who are maybe keeping data for kind of 10, 12 years and they don't need it. Another one is managing third-party contracts. So making sure that there are proper data processing agreements in place. And if those third parties, if those processors are based outside the UK or the EU, making sure there's an adequate data transfer mechanism in place. And then last one's probably employee awareness. I'm not sure training on GDPR is always the forefront of everyone's mind. It's not, we're busy and everybody's got lots of things to be doing, but it might be the case a lot of time where senior management understand GDPR, but employees don't necessarily, and they don't know what they're meant to be doing day in, day out. So those are probably the kind of 5 biggest issues I see. And this
can I build on 3 of those, Bab? Sorry.
Yeah, of course you can.
I love those. And there are 3 of them that I would, things like training the third party, absolutely. I always get very frustrated when people are training this. It's a reasonably cheap way of actually quite substantially improving your risk profile.
Yeah.
I want to build on 3 of your ones, right? We share that whole thing around well-documented data. That matters, obviously matters because it's personal data. It is clearly a GDPR, and in fact other jurisdictions have similar requirements, but also good technology due diligence for the valuation of a company will look at how well documented all technical assets are, especially data, and a couple of companies that I've done due diligence for, we've rejected on the grounds data is not well documented, and therefore what you're left with is real risks of single points of failure. One or two folks in the organization who understand what this model is and what it represents, and what the and therefore you go, if this person was to leave, we've got real problems. So yeah, absolutely. And then to the earlier point, right, if you've got data that's well documented, it's easily discoverable and easily potentially merge with other data to create that value we talked about. And then to your point about retention, actually, storage is cheap, but it's not that cheap.
No, it's not.
Volume. Yeah, it's as you retain data for years longer than you need, you can often shave good 5 or 6 figures off your bottom line of infrastructure simply by operating good retention practices. And so I guess the story I'm trying to tell is that the good news is that good practices around data privacy are often just good technology and infrastructure management practices.
Yeah, and actually allow you just to keep on top of a kind of sprawling organizational structure if you have everything well documented and properly set out, know where everything is. Don't keep anything, not just data, not personal data, but if you don't keep anything longer than you need it, it's just a more efficient way to run your package.
These things are not in conflict. Sometimes they're presented as in conflict, but they're often not. They're often there's enough synergies. There is
good management. Yeah, I agree.
One of the things that you said, Babs, that I'd like to just go back and dig into a bit more. So one is the mention of personal sensitive information. I think we've all heard that before, but exactly what is personal sensitive information and why do we need to treat that differently?
So there's personal information and then there's sensitive information, personal sensitive information. So personal data is any data that can identify an individual. So that sometimes I speak to people on consultation calls and they say, I don't hold any personal data. In most cases, that's entirely untrue. Because names, email addresses, IP addresses, it's all personal data. If you have someone's email coming into your inbox, you're holding some sort of personal data. So names, email addresses, telephone numbers, job titles, all of these things are personal data. Personal sensitive data is what's known as special category data under GDPR. And that is anything that is that little bit more sensitive. So that can be things like data that relates to racial, ethnic origin, political opinions, religious beliefs, genetic data, health data, sexual orientation, trade union membership is another one. We don't deal with a lot of clients that actually have trade unions, but in some cases it will be applicable. And there's a separate standard for having that sensitive personal data. When you're processing normal personal data, names, email addresses, etc., you need a lawful basis to be able to process that data. When it comes to this special category data, you need a second one. So a lot of the time that will include consent plus something else. So it might be consent plus you need the data to perform a contract, or consent plus you have a legitimate interest to process that data. And that sensitive data is typically subject to higher security measures. So there should be more restrictions around it. It should be stored in an even more secure manner. And the business should be conducting kind of data protection impact assessments to make sure that the sensitive data is being properly looked after and that they're assessing the risks and making sure that, you know, if this data gets out, it's a lot worse than names and email addresses. So there's that kind of higher surveillance really that's needed.
And actually, interestingly, two companies I worked with over time were organizing reasonably large scale events as part of their kind of brand building. And what we found was that they were, as part of that, they were perfectly legitimately asking for any religious dietary preferences, but then not stored. Then that was just a spreadsheet that was seemingly mailed around with absolutely no, and then retained on top of absolutely everything after the event. And actually that is special category data. If you express your religious choice as part of your dietary preference, often these things can actually appear in slightly unexpected places. So that impact assessment is absolutely key, even if it just should be part of the way of working, right?
Yeah, it should be. And sometimes if I'm speaking to a very early stage company and we're trying to work out, we're preparing a privacy policy or something like that, and we're trying to work out what data they're collecting. And it can be quite difficult to communicate, no, you should only be collecting the data you actually need. And if it's that sensitive data for a very specific purpose, and then we need to think about why you need it and the lawful basis for it. Sometimes I can speak to business owners who say, I'll just take gender and date of birth and telephone numbers just in case. And it was trying to say, as a business owner, I know you want this data because you might need it in future, but unless you have a legitimate reason for why you need it right now, let's minimize it.
Yeah,
and if you need it in future, update the privacy policy, tell people we can talk about it then, but we don't just take what we might need. We only take what we definitely need.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
Yeah.
It's giving you like bad cop today. Bad.
I'm always bad cop, unfortunately.
And I feel like we're starting to touch on kind of the restrictions, limitations of which I think is always met whenever there's a mention of GDPR, there's always like a grimace that kind of comes with it. But actually there are benefits. And I think both of you today have started to describe the benefits of well-maintained, well-managed kind of data services and data technology. From your perspective, what are some of the benefits that GDPR brings?
I do get the grimace and the shock horror with GDPR. I run a business. I understand it. More paperwork and more admin is never particularly on the top of anyone's list. Nobody wants to do it. But first of all, I think it's important to say that once you actually break the back with GDPR, there's not that much on an ongoing basis to do. It just needs a bit of thought at the beginning and then some kind of continuous, conscious behaviour throughout. But it seems worse than it is the first thing I would say. But in terms of the actual benefits that it offers, as you say, we've touched on them a bit already, but a business that manages its data well and puts the rights of data subjects first will always be seen with more trust and transparency in the industry. And actually it can be used as part of their sales and marketing efforts, and it can be put on their website and we are ISO certified or we comply with XYZ. That will always put them higher than their competitors in the industry because we are in the day and age where customers expect their data to be handled appropriately and they shun businesses who don't. So I think that's the first thing. And I guess leading on from that is it can lead to a competitive edge. So businesses with strong data protection practices are often more attracted to customers, but also investors and future buyers, etc. Nobody wants to invest in or buy a business where there's potentially something that's gone wrong with GDPR in the background. The fines alone are terrifying, never mind reputational damage. I think that's very important to think about. As businesses grow and develop, they have to be globally ready. So GDPR is generally seen as gold standard for data protection across the world. If businesses want to expand into the States or Canada or further afield, generally speaking, they'll go into that from a much better footing because they'll already have a lot of the processes and procedures in place that they need. And then the obvious one, which is reduced risk of breaches. Dealing with a data breach is time consuming, it's draining, it's financially exhausting because you have to take legal advice. You might be dealing with the ICO. You will be dealing with a very unhappy data subject or maybe several of them. You want to be focusing on growing and scaling your business. You don't want to be focusing on reputational management and just dealing with all the faff that comes with it.
I guess I add to that a little bit as well. So is that and you spoke earlier, Babs, about training and kind of getting your staff and your colleagues, especially as you're growing quickly, hopefully you're taking on a whole bunch of new talent into your business. Often the act of engaging new colleagues and existing colleagues in understanding how to act correctly in a legal and a secure, safe manner with data can be leveraged as a way of getting the business to think about data. If you think about something like Netflix, one of the thing that they often celebrate as part of their growth story, and I have no reason to doubt it's true, is that the amount of innovation they were able to drive from different colleagues across different domains in their company when they were several hundred people around big breakthroughs around whether it's a green light, post-pilot or second series productions based on analytics of patterns of subscriber reactions to those. Again, the very act of telling people to use data can be absolutely wrapped in with driving that culture of using data and then using it in a way that is legally sound.
It's very true. If that is the message that's coming from the top, that data is very precious and we need to protect it and approach how we use it in a very safe manner because it's precious and the data subjects have to be protected, but it's also very valuable.
That's right.
And it's very important to us as an organisation. It's a mindset shift, isn't it?
That's exactly right.
I'm really conscious that we need to wrap up, but I just wanted to, and I'm scanning through the questions. I haven't got to all of them, but
Sorry, we've spoken fart.
it's such a big subject, isn't it? I think we were optimistic to think we would cover it in 30 minutes. But Jason, I just wanted to come to you because I think there is a really interesting piece. We've talked about maximising, like the value of your data. We've talked about protecting data. I think there's also a piece which might be harder to measure. So I'd love to get your opinion on this, which is for organizations that are data driven and they've implemented their data strategies, how did they start to go about measuring the return on investment? So if they're investing in technology, if they're investing in strategies, they're teaching their culture, how do you start to measure the return on that?
Yeah, that's a great question. One which every kind of chief data officer or head of data that really grapples with. Let's be really honest, it's often very hard to do so because the counterfactual, because of data's replicability and kind of, I guess, kind of growth potential, the counterfactual is often impossible, especially with a startup to scale up, right? So we sometimes need to be a little bit honest to say, actually, it can be reasonably hard to measure impact. But there are techniques, right? You can make assumptions on counterfactuals. You can look at your customer acquisition program. Let's say you're a B2C and you acquired 10,000 customers, and you can trace some kind of path to, I think I would have captured 4,000 if I hadn't used that. You can do a customer lifetime value type analysis and then can do that. So when you're looking at using data for internal growth purposes or efficiency purposes, you just make some kind of, as I keep saying, counterfactual type assumptions, and then looking at the delta of both. Of course, and we need to be really honest about this. The slight problem with that is that you've got generally people who are data literate, you're marking your own homework, right? Because the people in a smallish organization, if you're in a huge organization like a Tesco, you will get external auditors, you will get KPMG or Capgemini to turn up and go, we'd spent X million here. Can you externally evaluate whether that drove the value that we expected to? And then that gives you the data leader a far greater footing because they can reference it, this kind of external thing. If you're a small company, 100 people with maybe 3, 5, 10 data experts, you're marking your own homework, right? So there's always going to be a degree of kind of potential cynicism, which is why, back to where you started, Claire, it does need to come from the top, right? That whole thing. Obviously, if you're monetizing data with a third party, then it's much easier because that's just a straight revenue stream, right? If I am taking a bunch of data and selling it into Criteo for marketing purposes, and they're paying me 100,000, it's just a straight revenue stream, right? Because that's quite straightforward. And especially for marketing purposes, often those agencies will themselves have fairly sophisticated A/B testing type mechanisms to say, we use this data to do this, but we didn't use it over here, so we can do that counterfactual more effectively. So there are techniques. It is awkward, and I would thank you. I would definitely encourage us to think about it, but not overthink it in a startup scale up sense.
It was so good. I feel like we would have to do a part 2 in the new year.
Oh,
So much more to cover. And I think actually half a page of questions that didn't get to. So it was like loads to get into. Really interesting conversation. Jason, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you for everybody who joined us live. And if you're watching on the replay, and if you've got any questions or any comments, or if you want to get in touch, all of our contact details will be below this video. So please do just reach out. We would love to hear from you. Jason, Babs, thank you so much for joining me this morning. I personally really enjoyed it, and catch up with you both again.
It was great. Thank you, Claire. And thank you so much for organising and hosting. It's been fantastic.
Yeah, very well run. Very well run, Claire. Thank you.
Thanks, guys. See you soon.